Slides. Welcome, everybody. I'm Terrence Lyons. I'm on the faculty at the Carter School, and welcome to Peace Week. I guess we're on day 4 of the 5 days of Peace Week, and there's already been, I don't know, maybe dozens of events and more to come. And so I hope everybody has had the chance to experience and enjoy that. We do this every semester. The Carter School does, in order to bring together faculty, students, alumni, friends, and partners from across the community for a week-long conversation about how to effectively address urgent issues of peace and justice. I'm extremely pleased to be able to introduce, and then I'll facilitate a discussion, question, and answer period afterwards, but to introduce Doug Addison, who was one of our, did this work as a student at the Carter School, and I'll let him talk about his work. Particularly, the only introduction I'll do to it for it is to emphasize how I think this work demonstrates how careful research based on a really nuanced understanding of the literature and embedding your research in the relevant debates and being very careful in terms of research design can help lead us to a different, better, greater understanding of some of the world's most pressing problems. In this case, questions around polarization, electoral violence, and autocratization. It's been my pleasure to work with Doug, and I look forward to hearing his presentation on this work. And Doug, why don't you pick it up? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Terrence. Yes, hi, I'm Doug Addison, recently retired and newly minted recipient of a MS in conflict analysis and resolution. Very grateful to the Carter School and George Mason University for the opportunity to share my research with you today. Special thanks go out to my committee chair, Dr. Thomas Flores, and my presentation sponsor and committee member, Dr. Terrence Lyons, and Dr. Agnieszka Paczynska, also on the committee, Charisse Cardenas, and Amber Williams, who put in all the tremendous amount of work to coordinate and even help save me just to get on this session through technological tricks. So I'd now like to present 11 more slides to you, and then we can open things up for any questions you might have. Regrettably, I may or may not be able to see what you put in chat, but I know Dr. Lyons can, so save your questions to the end, and then we'll rely on him to go through the chat and take questions that you might have. So, alrighty. Next slide, Terrence. Okay, so here's the agenda. I'll briefly describe the problem that I was looking at, go over the research objective, briefly discuss what affective political polarization is, review some selected findings to share with you, and then briefly discuss what the potential value added might be of this work. So what's the problem? Across the world, a growing number of incumbent political parties are unwilling to ensure inclusive and fair contests for power. And you can see on this slide an example from Nicaragua. They had elections in 2021, and the president of Nicaragua and his party were really reluctant to let their opposition compete, and they actually ended up jailing a number of candidates and intimidating and using violence against a lot of the opposition voters. So that's what you can see here in the picture. Now, while Ortega mainly used violence, autocratization is another popular option. An example is laws that make voter registration more difficult. Another example is discrimination in the way that rights are honored, so that people are not in a strong position to vote when elections do come up. In general, electoral violence and autocratization are both exclusionary. They are ways to deny the opposition the chance to participate in the political system. And democratization, especially in its early stages, tends to be inclusionary. So it's sort of the opposite tactic. So how are these concepts looking over time? We'll briefly go over that in the next slide. In this table, we're looking at how the exclusionary and inclusionary options impacted the share of most of the world's population during election years. And we're comparing average population shares over two 15-year time periods. From the first time period is 1991 to 2005, and the second time period is 2006 to 2020. And what you can see in the table is that the problem is clearly growing. The two exclusionary options impacted more people in the last 15 years than in the first 15 years. For example, incumbent-led electoral violence affected 38% of election year populations in the first 15 years, and that grew to 63% in the second 15 years. And episodes of autocratization affected only 3% in the first 15 years, but 23% in the second 15 years. And as for inclusionary tactics and democratization, episodes of democratization affected 15% of election year populations, 1991 to 2005, but only 8% in 2006 to 2020. So why? And is it possible that affective political polarization might have something to do with those trends? So let's go on to the next slide. So before answering that question, what exactly is affective political polarization? It's important to get the definition right, because there's a lot of different ways of looking at polarization in the literature. So this particular definition for affective political polarization is the degree of disaffection between members of two or more political parties. We're again looking at a new table. We're still looking at shares of election year populations. We're still looking at the same two time periods. If you look at the middle column, episodes of polarization affected 14% of election year populations between 1991 and 2005, and that grew to 40% in the years 2006 to 2020. And within those episodes of polarization, in the left-hand column, election year populations facing the highest levels of polarization were just 2% in the first 15 years, but 27% in the second 15-year period. And as for episodes of depolarization, well, first of all, the good news is there are many examples, but the bad news is that they affected 14% of election year populations, 1991 to 2005, and just 3% in 2006 to 2020. So polarization is on the rise, and you can see that in the graph on the far upper left-hand side of the slide, where we're looking at average global levels of affective political polarization. There's a little dip from 1991 to 2000 and a steady rise thereafter. So, question is, could affective political polarization be correlated with the data in the first table? And now it looks like we might have a reason to conduct some research. And here is the outline for that research. The objective of the research is to obtain useful insight as to how effective political polarization might be linked to outcomes where incumbent political parties exclude or include their opposition. But we have to keep things focused, so we're going to look just at the three outcomes under control of incumbent political parties. We'll look at electoral violence, autocratization, and democratization. And the specific question is whether and how effective political polarization is connected with combinations of incumbent-led electoral violence, autocratization, and democratization. So for example, you might have electoral violence alone, or you might have electoral violence in combination with autocratization or in combination with democratization. So we'll move on to some selected findings in the next slide, starting with correlations. And if the concepts move together over time, we can say they're positively correlated. So let's see how that looks in the next slide. In the left-hand side, you can see a dashed line falling down from left to right. That's episodes of depolarization as a share of election years. And you can see democratization and democratization with violence also generally falling. So there is a positive correlation between depolarization, democratization, and democratization with violence. In the right-hand side, you can see the dashed line rising from left to right, and that's episodes of polarization. And you can see that autocratization with violence and autocratization alone are generally rising together with polarization. So they too are positively correlated. And then you can also see at the top the yellow line, which is generally rising, especially in the early years. And that's electoral violence alone. That's a little bit more loosely correlated, but it's also positively correlated with polarization. This one takes a little bit of explaining, but not too much. To start with, there are 6 combinations of electoral violence, autocratization, and democratization, and they're shown in the figure, each with its own color. So for example, at the top, that's where there's no activity, no violence, no autocratization, no democratization. The red rectangle is for autocratization alone. The orange rectangle is autocratization with violence. The yellow rectangle is electoral violence by itself. The green rectangle is democratization with violence. The blue rectangle is democratization alone, without violence. So if you were participating in an election characterized by one of these boxes in the years 1991 to 2020, perhaps the red rectangle for autocratization, what would the next election most likely look like? That's the transition probabilities that we're going to be looking at here. For example, if you were in the red rectangle and you were in an election where autocratization was happening, maybe voter suppression, what's the most likely outcome in the next election? And what this figure tells us is that 68% of most subsequent elections would also be under autocratization. But 21% in that big, thick downward arrow are moving to autocratization with violence. So if you're not staying within autocratization, the most likely outcome other than that is autocratization with violence. And if you end up there, the next election after that is also probably going to be autocratization with violence. But 25% of those elections escape into electoral violence alone. And the retention rate is even higher. That's 86%. So things look like you're in a worsening situation here. Only 8% of elections following electoral violence move to democratization with violence, and 36% of those move back to electoral violence alone. So it's pretty tough to move to democratization. If you're in an election with democratization and violence, there's a 6.5% chance that you can move to democratization alone without violence. But if you're in democratization alone, there's a 4% chance you'll move back to democratization with violence. But the good news is that 42% of elections under democratization move to stability, where there's no further changes in terms of democratization, autocratization, or violence. So what do we make of this? And how does effective political polarization come into this story, if at all? So here's the fun part of the thesis. How are we going to explain what we just saw in the data? So this happens to be a hypothesis generating thesis rather than testing. I have two key hypotheses. The first is that party members prefer to avoid the emotional cost of losing elections in addition to losing power in general. And the emotional cost rises with effective political polarization. And the auxiliary hypothesis is that the risk of losing power is highest when party seat polarization is highest. And by that, I mean when two political parties control nearly equal numbers of seats in a national legislature. And you can see in the little illustration there, the red and the blue have nearly equal numbers of seats. And if only one or two seats shift, then power shifts from one side to the other. So that's your most precarious position. So a felt threat to power could come from the cost of losing, meaning the emotional cost of losing, or the high risk of losing if you're almost equal number of seats. And we'll go to the next slide now, the fancy looking one. So here's a preliminary sketch of how things might work. Starting on the left-hand side. So maybe you've got party leaders and they feel a threat to power. And they ask themselves, is party seat polarization high or not? The party seat polarization is high, meaning just a few seats lost could put them out of power. And then they're going to look at their fiscal capacity to, say, buy off the opposition through patronage, or put the police force out there to intimidate the opposition, or what have you. And they're also going to be looking at the cost of violence, which I posit tends to rise as institutions and countries develop. So in the case where fiscal capacity is low and the cost of violence is low, as in many less developed countries, the best option to keep your opposition from gaining any seats is to use violence. And if you're in a country where your government has strong fiscal capacity and the cost of violence is high, then your best chance to keep the opposition out is to autocratize. Or you might fall somewhere in the middle and you would choose autocratization with violence. So we've covered 3 of our combinations right there. Now, if party seat polarization is not high, meaning that the incumbent party has a lot of seats, in theory, they could give some up, but why would they? I posit that that would only happen if there was adequate felt pressure from the opposition. And you can imagine that might come through any variety of techniques. I mean, it could be nonviolent protest, it could be revolution, it could be some sort of insurgency, we don't know. But so if that pressure is felt and there are some seats that could be given up to the opposition, democratization is certainly a possibility. Would you do it with or without violence? And the logic that I'm proposing is that if the opposition is solidly tolerable to the incumbent, there's no need to use violence. But it may be that part of the opposition is tolerable and part of the opposition is intolerable so far as the incumbent is concerned, in which case you would see democratization with violence. They'd be welcoming the tolerable faction, and they'd be using electoral violence against those that they found intolerable. So at this point, we've now covered all the bases as far as the inclusionary and exclusionary options are concerned. This scheme, I'm sure, doesn't explain all countries at all times, but only further testing can tell us how viable this is. But given the data that I've seen, I think it's got pretty good prospects. So if this sort of logic is confirmed, what would the value added be? For analysts, the value could be using the transition matrix and the framework of hypotheses I just showed you to assess the prospects for electoral violence, autocratization, and democratization. So for example, take the USA. It's a well-developed country. The fiscal capacity is very high. The cost of violence is also very high. We have high affective political polarization. And if you look at the balance of power in Congress, it's about evenly balanced. So we also have high party seat polarization. So we are at high risk for autocratization. And in fact, that's what the statistics from places like Freedom House or Varieties of Democracy are telling us is already underway. But electoral violence by the incumbent party, that would not be predicted by the logic I've laid out. That's a bit of a surprise and would be good motivation for further research. Value added for practitioners, definitely there. It could help reduce violence and autocratization by helping reduce effective political polarization. And some options are de-escalating violence. Less violence usually helps depolarize. De-escalate polarizing rhetoric. Politicians can help. The media can help. It may help to regulate social media. I think the jury's not in yet on that one, but it's a possibility. Long run economic development can help. Institutional reforms can help. For example, countries that have presidential systems might be able to reduce the stakes of winning and losing by um, eh, getting more power to the Congress or Parliament in those countries, so that winning or losing the presidency isn't quite so fraught. Other options include the introduction of third parties with proportional representation or ranked choice voting. But point being that there are definitely a variety of ways to depolarize, and through so doing, reducing the risk of electoral violence and autocratization. So that's what I've got. And I thank you for your time. If you've got questions, let Terrence know. If you want to follow up with me in person, my email address is on the screen there. I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Doug. It's Terrence Lyons back. We have quite an audience, which I'm very happy to see. And so you can use the little raise hand feature, and then I'll know that you want to have a question, or you could post something in the chat, and I will do my very best to collect those as well. Let me see if I can get my question out as people collect their thoughts. First of all, again, to congratulate you on this great example of a kind of early theory building of developing typologies and thinking through the logic and then setting up a research agenda to see how whether the logic is how robust your proposed logic turns out to be. What I want to ask you about is, you referenced it at the very end, although it was on my mind before then, is that your model seems to maybe not assume or to predict that most of these systems are two-party systems. You either win or you lose. And that, of course, is the case in the US and the UK to an extent, but not the case in many other parts of the world, where there are coalition systems and PR systems and prime minister systems, where I would think the logic of losing an election would be very different than in a two-party, kind of zero-sum competition. So do you think your logic is equally robust in multi-party systems as it is in two-party systems? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really great one. That was something I worried about. I didn't address extensively, but I did find several assertions in the literature that often in multi-party democracies where there is polarization, the number of coalitions sort of collapse to two effective coalitions. So it may well be that there's 3 or 4 or 5, but they still, in the end, effectively come down to two clashing sides. And I think I found that in places like Howard and others who have tracked a lot of these types of situations. So I can't swear definitively that that is always the case, but there are claims in the literature that that's the tendency.
Fabulous. I do think it would be a rich area for further research. Of course, I don't expect any single piece of research to answer all questions, but I know in parts of other parts of the world, including Europe and elsewhere, coalition politics rather than two-party politics are the norm. I see a couple of questions in the chat. I'm happy to allow people to unmute and ask their questions directly, but if they prefer, I'm happy to ask the questions as well. And why don't I then start with the first question? I'm only seeing initials MW, which says, asks the question, perhaps, or starts with a statement, perhaps we could conclude that the United States is not such a developed nation, or that the cost of violence is not very high for those inflicting it. Do you have any reflections on that?
One could speculate that way. I think it's certainly the case that the U.S. has a relatively strong fiscal capacity within its government relative to other places I've been. And the GDP per capita is certainly much higher than most of the illiberal countries. So I don't know if I could endorse that idea, but I could certainly say that and confirm that the U.S. is a relatively young, liberal democracy, in the sense that the true application of civil rights, voting rights, non-discriminatory application of the law really came into effect only in the late 1960s, 1970s, and only imperfectly. So in that sense, we're young.
Thank you. I think that is at least reflective of some of the concerns that many of us have, that maybe the potential for things like electoral violence and autocratization in the United States is higher now than it has been recently. But I take your point, is that we have to measure how liberal the United States was historically. Giselle, who is wonderful to see your name at least, old friend of the program, asks a question about the how do you define polarization, and have you developed some indicators? I think you have more of that in your research study than perhaps you were able to present today, but can you say something about how you defined polarization?
Yeah, sure. So again, we are looking in this work only at affective political polarization. So that is the degree of disaffection, distrust, dislike shared between the members of one political group about another political group. And the specific measure that I was using was provided by Varieties of Democracy Project. And they had their panel of experts produce these estimates for almost all the countries in the world, going back from 1900 onwards. It may be that their measure is imperfect, and I think future scholars should try to use survey data more and more. It's expensive and difficult to find, which is why the VDEM data is such a treasure right now. But I do think that's where the future will be. But we're not talking about policy polarization. We're not talking about left-right polarization. We're thinking only about affect, how people like or dislike each other. Hope that helps.
I think that does elaborate, and I think I'm trying to turn off message beeps, and I apologize for any interference of the sound. I'm still struggling with some of the technology here. Maybe in response to another question, somebody asked if the slides could be made available, and I leave that to you, Doug. If you wish to, we could circulate those. We are recording this session, for those of you, all of us should know that, but I'll leave it to Doug whether he's prepared to share these slides. Let me move on to a question from Anna, who asks, do you think that the type of governments a country holds can affect how much polarization can affect an election? Most countries I have seen fall from democratization to autocracies have been presidential ones. So maybe that's related to my question of PR systems and parliamentary systems. Do you think that presidential systems are particularly at risk of autocratization?
Hi, Anna. That's a great question. I did not specifically look at that carefully in the research. I could say anecdotally, I didn't see a lot of difference in the data along those lines, but I don't want to make a strong pronouncement without doing further careful work.
Thank you, Doug. I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody who's raising their hands. I've seen some of the questions in the chat, but if somebody wishes to ask directly by raising a hand, that is also fine, and I presume I will see it as a raised hand. Isabel, why don't you ask your question, please?
Great.
Unmute and ask your question.
This was a really interesting presentation, first of all. Thank you very much. I had a question specifically. What do you think is sort of the prognosis for countries who are experience this sort of cycle of electoral violence and polarization in general, but if you are specifically familiar with the situation of Venezuela, that's my home country. So if you have any particular thoughts about that, I would really appreciate them. Thank you.
Yeah. Terrence, I don't know if you're able to put back up that slide with the different rectangles.
We can try, can't we?
Okay, so Venezuela right now is vacillating between the yellow and the orange rectangles, where you either have elections under autocratization and violence or electoral violence alone. And if the probabilities transitioning from one kind of election to the next from 1991 to 2020 continue to hold in the future, and if the level of polarization in Venezuela continues to be as high as it is, the prognosis is not very happy, because generally when you're in one of these rectangles, the retention rate from one election to the next is very high, and the ability to move out of those is quite constrained. So that's a situation where I think a concerted effort is going to have to be made to depolarize. And I don't want to say that depolarization alone is going to be the answer, because I'm sure there are many other aspects to this problem that will have to be addressed. But within the framework of this research, clearly Venezuela is in a very difficult situation just now.
Is this the same as, okay, now I have something from, no, I guess I don't have other questions. Do I have any other hands that are up right now? I don't see other hands, but if somebody has one, please let me know. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to take the advantage of controlling the microphone, as it were, to ask you another question, Doug. And I do have an advantage in that I read the underlying master's thesis that this research draws upon, and Doug and I have talked about this multiple times. But it has to do with, if you agree with me here, Doug, is that your concern is this affective political polarization kind of raises the stakes and make everything more difficult because there's an emotional cost to learning. And I think that is a reasonable conclusion. I also, however, wonder if the degree of disaffection between members of two or more political parties is your core variable. I wonder if too little disagreement between members of two or more political parties is also problematic. So in other words, if you think, I'm not sure I would argue this about the United States anymore, but I might have said this 10 years ago, that the Democratic and the Republican Party are basically two centrist parties, there's not much of a difference between them, and that's a problem. So in other words, too little polarization can be bad for democracy because there's no choice. but at the same time, too much polarization can also be problematic. And I don't know how we work our way through that dilemma or that contradiction. How do we live in that contradiction of that we want choice, but we don't want polarization? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, that's certainly a really famous tension in the literature and in practice. We know that the what was it? The American Social Association of Political Scientists back in 1957 or so, I can't remember, said exactly what you said, Terrence, that the American system is too centrist and voters are having a hard time distinguishing between the parties, and they should distinguish themselves further. Surely they did. But there is some strands of literature where political scientists and even some conflict researchers have found that a moderate degree of polarization can be a useful thing. In fact, even fairly strong polarization can be a motivating factor in favor of further democratization. But what matters then is the associated conditions, the context that this polarization exists within, right? So, for example, Lebas, L-E, capital B-A-S, found that in many cases, polarization was an aid to democratization, but not in those contexts where the two polarized groups were facing ethnic disaffection, where they were disliking and distrusting each other on the basis of ethnicity. There, the rift was too strong, couldn't be overcome. So I guess the bottom line is it's likely that context matters.
I think that's probably a pretty reasonable conclusion, is that it's the tendency to look for clear, it's either A or B outcomes, which is maybe a problem or a challenge for many social scientists. I think you're right to come back to argue that maybe context matters. I have one further question myself. I do want to urge, we still have a number of people in the room, as it were, to either raise their hand or to put something in the chat if you prefer for me to read the question. But my final question for you, Doug, has to do with your very final slide. In fact, the second bullet point on your very final, or your value added slide. I guess you had a thank you slide after that one. And that is about what this all might mean for practitioners, things that might be done by people who are seeking to play roles as peacemakers. What you mentioned a few of them, but I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more and perhaps even say a word or two about the things that you're doing to try to avoid these the possibilities for further electoral violence and autocratization because of polarization.
There is well, so following the logic of the research, the presumption would be that anything a practitioner could do to reduce the level of affective political polarization would likely help reduce the risk of electoral violence and the risk of autocratization. But then the question would become, in somebody else's research or in any subsequent new research I might do, what are the effective ways to do that? And there's an entirely different literature. It's very rich. And I went over briefly some of the options in that literature. there is a tendency for violence to polarize. So knowing that, de-escalating violence is likely to help depolarize. We know that a lot of politicians use polarizing rhetoric, and in the same manner, they could certainly use depolarizing rhetoric. The same could be said of the media. There's some people thinking that perhaps social media help amplify polarization, and regulation might help reduce that effect. There are, well, the logic of polarization, where you have just two parties at each other's throats, is implicitly addressed by introducing third and fourth and fifth parties. I mean, the more parties you can inject, by definition, are going to help reduce polarization. So if political systems can be modified either organically or through some concerted, organized fashion, that might help. Proportional representation would probably want to go along with that, or if not, then perhaps something like ranked choice voting. That's another possibility. We also know that people tend to get polarized when resources are short, when they begin to feel like they're in a zero-sum game. And the answer to that, unfortunately, takes time, but long-run economic development can help ameliorate those things. It's also likely that avoiding foolish policies that exacerbate ongoing economic situations could, in many instances, help avoid unnecessary polarization. So if a country is facing very high levels of inflation, it wouldn't do to pour fuel on that fire. So, I mean, for example, in Turkey right now, I would say that's a pretty big risk. Venezuela, you could see that inflation isn't helping. So those are some of the possibilities. And I'm confident that the literature includes far more than I could fairly address right now. There's a lot out there.
Indeed, it's an agenda that will keep people who are trying to promote peace building and more, less polarized politics in places like the United States will keep us busy for very, very a long time. If anybody else would like to come in with a question, either by raising their hand or putting it in the chat, I'd be happy to entertain it. Otherwise, I'm approaching the point where I'm going to thank Doug very, very much. Anybody else want to come in before I do that? Maybe to give people one more chance to think of their questions. I mean, Doug, you had your email on one of your slides, and so I assume you're happy to be contacted. Could we put that in the chat, and then for people who wish to follow up or to get access to your slides or whatever else it might be, they will be able to contact you directly. Are there any final thoughts? Any final thing you want to leave us with, Doug? Or
well, one for sure. I think it's the entire focus and purpose of the Carter School to be helping to manage or reduce these conflicts around the world. And so, I think that's where a lot of excitement, energy, and hope can be located. And just so thrilled to be able to know all of you and see the work you're doing. And I think that this is where a lot of our future will lie, is in this work, mediation and negotiation, and all of the careful studies that is being done by all the members of the school.
I think that's very well put. The other thing I like about your approach is it's not simply about the polarization and violence that's taking place over there. It very much includes what's happening just down the street from our school, and recognizing that the United States and other developed countries, whether it might be, Hungary or the UK or Turkey or Brazil or others, similarly face these challenges. With that being said, I want to thank you very much, Doug, both for this work and for spending time presenting it with us. We have another full day of Peace Week activities tomorrow. You should check them out. Amber has put it in the chat. If you just go to the Carter School gmu.edu and begin fishing around, you'll find our list. And there's a lot of other further interesting sessions, some virtual, some face-to-face, and you can have an opportunity to get some experience with the broad and diverse work that's being done by the Carter School faculty, students, alumni, and friends. But without any other further ado, let me thank Doug once again and wish you all a very happy evening. Thank you.